Chicago in late spring was a city of contradictions. The sun reflected off glass towers, painting gold streaks across Lake Michigan, while below, traffic hummed in restless rhythm. Daniel Harper's apartment on the 23rd floor of a modern high-rise offered a panoramic view of this duality, the polished illusion of urban success above and the chaotic pulse of life below. It was here, amid minimalist furnishings and the faint scent of jasmine from Olivia's favorite candles, that the Harper family played out their carefully curated roles. From the outside, Daniel's life seemed enviable. A respected attorney specializing in corporate law, he moved with a quiet authority that colleagues admired. His wife, Olivia, epitomized sophistication, always poised, always articulate, with a social calendar as full as any New York socialites. And then there was Emily, Olivia's 16-year-old daughter, whose blonde hair and intense green eyes had inherited both her mother's beauty and a knack for persuasion that often left Daniel wary. Every morning began with precision. Daniel brewed his coffee just so. Olivia skimmed the latest fashion magazines, and Emily meticulously laid out her school books, often shooting Daniel a fleeting look of disapproval. A visitor might mistake these small tensions for normal teenage moodiness, but Daniel had learned to read the subtle cues. The narrowed eyes, the delayed smiles, the sighs that carried more weight than words. The Harper family's dinner rituals were equally scripted. Plates aligned perfectly on the oak table, wine glasses sparkling under the soft chandelier, laughter carefully timed to fill the space without ever revealing the gaps in understanding. Daniel often found himself observing rather than participating, noting how Olivia's smiles sometimes didn't reach her eyes, how Emily's chatter carried an edge of accusation that he couldn't quite name. These small discrepancies gnawed at him, but Daniel buried his unease under layers of logic. Perhaps Emily was just testing boundaries. Perhaps Olivia was stressed from work. Yet the cracks had already begun to form. Emily had taken to whispering things under her breath when she thought Daniel wasn't listening. A muttered complaint about a strict curfew, a subtle accusation about favoritism, a pointed remark about how some people just don't understand family. Olivia, absorbed in her own routines, seemed to catch only fragments. Daniel, though trained to see patterns in legal cases, found no rulebook for the subtleties of familial deception. One Saturday morning, Daniel sat on the balcony with his laptop, preparing for an important client meeting. Olivia was inside, humming to herself as she arranged flowers in a crystal vase. Emily wandered into the kitchen, glanced at Daniel with a practiced frown, and asked, "Are you going to lecture Mom again about my grades?" Her tone was casual, almost playful, but Daniel felt the underlying challenge. "I haven't spoken to your mother about your grades," he replied, keeping his voice measured. "Why would you think I have?" Emily shrugged, but the corner of her mouth quirked as if she'd already won some silent battle. Daniel realized, with a sinking sense of inevitability, that this was more than teenage rebellion. It was the beginning of a pattern he could sense but not yet name. The subtle manipulation of perception, the careful twisting of facts, the quiet war being waged in shadows where he was always one step behind. Daniel often recalled the early days of their marriage. Olivia had seemed infallible then, radiant and attentive, with an infectious laughter that filled their first apartment downtown. Emily had been a child of innocence, curious and affectionate, seeking his attention without the complications of adolescent schemes. Now, years later, that innocence felt like a memory stolen from him, replaced by something sharper, something that measured and tested him with every glance. Evenings were the hardest. After work, Daniel would return to the apartment, exhausted yet alert to the smallest emotional tremor. Olivia would recount her day in meticulous detail, a practiced blend of charm and warmth, while Emily interjected with strategically timed anecdotes that always seemed to frame Daniel as impatient, unfeeling, or absent. Friends who visited rarely noticed, or perhaps they chose not to. The Harper family's public facade remained impeccable. Smiles, polite conversation, occasional laughter, but Daniel knew it was an illusion, a delicate art of misdirection that left him questioning his own sanity. As he sipped his coffee, Daniel stared at the reflection of the city in the glass balcony railing. Above, the sunlight gleamed with promise. Below, the streets pulsed with the reality of life. Relentless, messy, unpredictable. In that moment, Daniel understood the cruel irony. The very perfection he had worked for, the life he had meticulously built, was a fragile mirage. Every laugh, every display of harmony, every carefully curated photograph for social media was a mask. And behind that mask, shadows of distrust were spreading quietly, inexorably, like cracks in the foundation of a once solid building. Daniel Harper, for all his intelligence in success, felt the first true pangs of helplessness. He had built a career exposing lies and finding truths, yet within his own home, truth was elusive, and the very people he loved most were unknowingly, or perhaps deliberately, keeping it from him. And in that quiet, sunlit morning, he realized that the illusion of perfection was not just fragile, it was already beginning to crumble. The weekend arrived with a deceptive calm. Chicago's spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint tang of the lake. Daniel had planned a quiet Saturday, catch up on paperwork, respond to client emails, and perhaps take a walk along the riverfront. But beneath the mundane surface, the Harper household was already shifting, guided by invisible currents of misperception and manipulation. Emily had perfected the art of subtle insinuation. It began with small comments, casual enough to appear accidental. "I guess some dads don't really care," she murmured one morning, while Daniel helped her straighten her school uniform. Her voice was soft, almost childlike, but the implication was clear. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked down at her, searching for a flicker of mischief, a smile that would reveal the jest. But there was none. Emily's green eyes were steady, controlled, calculating. Olivia, meanwhile, moved through the apartment with her usual grace, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see the tension brewing. She hummed as she arranged a stack of magazines on the coffee table, occasionally glancing at her daughter with a warmth that Daniel found increasingly disorienting. He had learned over the years that Olivia's love for Emily was fierce and protective, but that same devotion could blind her to subtle truths. Daniel had always known this, but he had never anticipated how it could turn against him. The first confrontation came over breakfast. Emily had prepared a perfectly innocent question, or so it appeared. "Dad, why do you always get upset when Mom asks you about my schedule?" she asked, stirring her cereal with delicate precision. Her voice was casual, yet it carried the weight of accusation. Daniel paused, searching for the right words, but any answer seemed fraught with danger. "I don't get upset," he said finally, trying to keep his voice calm. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page." Emily tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Mom says you make everything about work. Maybe she's right." Daniel's stomach sank. That simple statement, delivered with teenage nonchalance, was like a spark dropped into dried tinder. Olivia, hearing the exchange, gave a faint smile, assuming it was a harmless domestic disagreement. But Daniel knew better. He had seen the pattern before, small seeds of doubt, carefully planted, waiting to take root in fertile ground. Throughout the day, Daniel tried to engage normally. He suggested a walk along the river, an outing to the local art museum, any activity that might bridge the growing emotional gap. Emily declined with polite excuses, and Olivia remained non-committal. The silence that filled the apartment was heavier than any argument. It was the quiet of walls closing in, of trust eroding imperceptibly. Later, while reviewing case notes for a corporate negotiation, Daniel discovered a small envelope tucked under the corner of Emily's backpack. Inside were several printed emails, messages she had forwarded from a school friend, each subtly framing Daniel as controlling and unreasonable. His heart thudded. It was one thing to sense a problem, it was another to see it documented in such deliberate detail. He realized Emily was not just testing boundaries, she was scripting a narrative, one she knew Olivia might believe. That evening, dinner was strained. Olivia recounted her day with her usual poise, occasionally glancing at Daniel for affirmation. Emily, seated across from him, added innocuous comments, yet each was designed to cast Daniel in a negative light. "I guess some people don't really understand teenagers," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Daniel felt the sting but held his composure. He had learned over years in courtrooms that anger rarely helps in situations requiring persuasion. After dinner, Daniel retreated to his study, a small space lined with law books and family photographs. He sank into his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of Olivia, not as the radiant, infallible woman he had married, but as someone caught between love for him and unwavering trust in her daughter. And Emily, whose cunning seemed almost preternatural, weaving a web of perception that threatened to ensnare everyone around her. Daniel recalled a conversation with his colleague Mark, who once warned him, "Family isn't a courtroom, but people can be just as manipulative behind closed doors." He had dismissed it then as cynicism. Now he understood. The law gave him clarity and control, but home offered neither. Every word, every glance, every small gesture could be twisted, misinterpreted, and used as evidence in a trial that had nothing to do with legality, but everything to do with love and trust. That night, Daniel lay awake listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Lights from neighboring apartments flickered, revealing lives that seemed just as polished, just as curated as his own. He wondered how many of those couples carried quiet resentments, unspoken accusations, the seeds of distrust planted by those they loved most. And in the silence, he felt the first real pangs of fear. Not for his career, not for his social standing, but for the fragile bond that tied his family together. As he stared at the ceiling, he made a silent vow. He would not allow perception to replace truth. He would find a way to protect himself, to uncover the reality behind the smiles and whispers, and to hold on to the dignity and love that still lingered beneath the surface. Yet as he resolved this, he knew that the battle would not be straightforward. Lies, once planted, grew faster than logic, and sometimes the hardest part of any fight was convincing the people you love that they were being deceived. In the Harper household, the illusion of harmony remained intact for the casual observer. But within its walls, the seeds of distrust had already sprouted, their roots tangled deep in the hearts of both the deceived and the deceiver. And Daniel, for all his skill in navigating truth and falsehood, sensed that the coming days would test every ounce of patience, every shred of emotional resilience he possessed.
The week began with a gray sky hanging over Chicago, casting the streets and skyscrapers in muted shades of silver and slate. Daniel walked through the office lobby with his usual confident stride, briefcase in hand. Yet beneath the polished exterior, a gnawing unease persisted. His colleagues greeted him warmly, unaware that behind the sharp suits and practiced smiles, Daniel's personal life was unraveling in silence. The subtle fractures at home had begun to seep into every corner of his existence. He arrived at the office early, hoping to immerse himself in work and escape the tension that had grown between Olivia and him. But even in the sterile clarity of legal documents, he could not shake the feeling of being misunderstood, misrepresented, and increasingly alone. His phone buzzed intermittently with notifications from Olivia and Emily. Harmless questions, or so they appeared. Each one, Daniel suspected, carried layers of implication, a shadow of accusation wrapped in civility. Emily's manipulations had grown bolder. She spoke in ways that seemed innocent, yet carried a double edge. A casual remark about Daniel's impatience became fodder for Olivia's doubts. A slight frown while Daniel helped with homework was later recounted by Emily as anger or criticism. Every encounter left Daniel more defensive, more cautious in words and gestures. He had become hyper-aware of how his actions might be twisted, even in the privacy of their apartment. Olivia, meanwhile, began to pull away. She was not cruel nor intentionally distant, but Daniel could sense her trust eroding. Subtle comments, questions phrased with doubt, and a lingering hesitation in her touch all marked a shift he could not ignore. She no longer sought his opinion as she once had. She no longer shared the small triumphs of her day. The intimacy that had defined their marriage was replaced by polite routines and careful observations, as if they were strangers learning to cohabitate rather than partners who had built a life together. At lunch, Daniel met with a close friend and colleague, Mark, who noticed the shadow under his eyes. "You've been distracted," Mark said. "Is everything okay at home?" Daniel forced a smile. "Everything's fine," he replied, the words tasting hollow. He would not articulate the full truth, that at home he felt trapped in a narrative being written about him by the very people he loved. Even speaking the truth aloud might make him sound paranoid, or worse, guilty. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment to find Emily sprawled on the living room sofa, her phone in hand. "Mom says you're too controlling," she said casually, scrolling through social media. The remark was delivered with the nonchalance of someone discussing the weather. Yet Daniel felt the weight of accusation pressed down on him. Olivia, entering moments later, paused mid-step. "What did you just say?" she asked, her tone calm but tinged with concern. Emily repeated the statement, framing it with an air of innocence that made it nearly impossible to dispute. Daniel opened his mouth to clarify, to explain, but paused. Any word he spoke now could be turned against him, misinterpreted in the subtle ways that Emily had perfected. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery against china. Conversation was minimal. Emily's eyes darted between Daniel and Olivia, watching reactions, recording in silence. Daniel felt increasingly invisible. A man whose intentions were constantly questioned, whose character was assessed in whispered narratives he could not control. The isolation was suffocating. He had allies in the world outside, the courtroom, the office, old friends. But at home, he was an outsider in his own life. Later, in the solitude of his study, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the window, and tried to piece together the fragments of truth from the distortions he recognized as evidence of a subtle war being waged in shadows. He had confronted difficult adversaries in court, negotiated settlements, and navigated hostile boardrooms, yet nothing had prepared him for the isolation of being misjudged and misrepresented by his own family. Daniel's reflections were interrupted by a faint sound, the soft laughter of Olivia and Emily from the living room. It was ordinary, mundane, yet in that ordinary sound, Daniel heard layers of tension and unspoken conflict. He realized with a bitter clarity that he could not rely on assumptions of trust anymore. His presence, his words, his actions, all could be reframed and misinterpreted. The very fabric of his domestic life had become a courtroom of perception, and he was the silent defendant. In that moment, Daniel understood the stakes. It was not just about minor misunderstandings or teenage rebellion. It was about perception, narrative, and the power of belief. Emily's lies, small and insidious, were eroding the foundation of trust between him and Olivia. He needed to act, but cautiously. Any misstep could accelerate the isolation he already felt. As night deepened, Daniel sat by the window, looking out over the city lights. The streets below sparkled with life and possibility, indifferent to his private turmoil. He felt a profound loneliness, the kind that gnawed quietly but persistently at the heart. In the quiet of his apartment, he realized that isolation was not just a physical state, it was a psychological battlefield, where every interaction was a test of patience, perception, and resilience. And Daniel Harper, for all his experience and intellect, understood that the hardest truth of all was that he was losing ground in the place where he should have felt safest, his own home.
The rain began quietly that Tuesday afternoon, a soft drizzle pattering against the high-rise windows of the Harper apartment. Daniel sat at his desk, the hum of the city below muffled by the storm, his mind restless. Work lay unfinished in scattered files and open tabs on his laptop, but his thoughts kept returning home, to the subtle distortions of perception that had made his own family feel like strangers. He had begun noticing inconsistencies, small, almost imperceptible, yet increasingly alarming. Emily's comments, her stories, the way she recounted events to Olivia with a hint of exaggeration. Daniel realized that beneath the surface of teenage rebellion, there was a calculated narrative at play. The problem was he had no concrete proof, nothing that could disrupt the delicate web Emily had woven. Until today. While retrieving a document from the office printer, he noticed a folded envelope tucked behind a stack of Emily's school books on the living room counter. His pulse quickened. The envelope was unmarked, its presence innocuous, yet his instincts screamed otherwise. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of printed emails, text message screenshots, and handwritten notes. His eyes scanned the words, the pattern emerging like a sinister blueprint. Emily had been systematically framing him, casting his actions as controlling, cold, or uncaring. The first message was from one of Emily's school friends, detailing a minor disagreement Daniel had had with her over grades, twisted into a narrative of aggression. The second was a forwarded text from Emily herself, carefully phrased to make Olivia doubt his intentions. And beneath them, a small, folded note in Emily's handwriting. "Dad doesn't understand me. Mom should know." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the implications. These weren't mere teenage complaints. They were deliberate attempts to shake perception, to isolate him emotionally from the people he loved most. The precision of it unnerved him. Emily's words had been planting seeds of distrust for months, invisible to all but him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to feel the full weight of betrayal. Not from a lover, not from a colleague, but from a child he had come to love as his own. The depth of Emily's manipulation was shocking, but what struck him more was Olivia's unknowing complicity. Her love for Emily, fierce and protective, had become a lens through which truth was filtered, leaving him distorted, his intentions misread. Determined to confront the situation with clarity, Daniel began documenting everything. Emails, texts, notes, every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged. He created a timeline, tracing incidents back several months, noting patterns, motives, and outcomes. Each entry confirmed what he had suspected. Emily's deception was intentional, methodical, and powerful in its subtlety. That evening, Daniel sat at the dinner table, envelope hidden discreetly in his briefcase. Olivia chatted about her day, her eyes occasionally searching his for reactions. Emily leaned back in her chair, arms folded, the faintest smirk playing on her lips. The family tableau looked ordinary, perfect even, but Daniel knew the truth beneath the surface. He was carrying knowledge that could upend their lives, yet he understood that timing, patience, and strategy were crucial. Later he retreated to the study, placing the envelope on the desk and spreading its contents out carefully. He touched each piece of paper, reading and rereading, the lines of manipulation more apparent with every glance. He realized he could no longer operate in the shadows of uncertainty. If he wanted to protect himself and, in some sense, salvage the family he loved, he needed a plan, one that revealed the truth without destroying the fragile emotional balance entirely. As the rain intensified, Daniel remembered moments from the past, small gestures of Emily's apparent affection, fleeting smiles, nights that Olivia had praised his patience and dedication. They all seemed tainted now, reframed by the awareness of manipulation. He understood that perception was malleable, and Emily had become a master sculptor, crafting a narrative that positioned him as the antagonist. Yet within him burned a quiet determination. Daniel had spent his life navigating truth and falsehood, dissecting arguments, unraveling deception. The same skills that served him in the courtroom could serve him here. He would gather the evidence, build the narrative carefully, and let the truth emerge. He would confront Emily, protect himself, and ensure Olivia saw the reality for what it was. But he also knew this path would be emotionally treacherous. Revealing manipulation in a family required precision. Too much, too soon, could fracture bonds irreparably. Night settled over the city, rain streaking the windows with chaotic artistry. Daniel remained at his desk, the envelope and its contents spread before him like fragments of a puzzle that demanded assembly. He traced the lines of deceit, connecting incidents and motives, mapping a hidden landscape of betrayal. And in the quiet solitude, he made a silent vow. He would unearth every secret, expose every distortion, and reclaim his place, not just in the household, but in the hearts of the people who mattered most. By the time he finally closed his eyes, Daniel Harper felt a strange combination of exhaustion and resolve. The seeds of distrust had taken root, but now he held the key to understanding, and, perhaps, reversing their growth. The game was changing, and for the first time in months, he felt the faint glimmer of hope that perception could be corrected, that truth could emerge from the shadows, and that the illusion of perfection, though cracked, might still be salvaged.
By midweek, tension in the Harper household had thickened into an almost tangible presence. The air felt heavier, each footstep carrying the weight of unspoken grievances. Daniel moved through the apartment with caution, aware that every word, every gesture could be interpreted as evidence against him. He had spent days documenting Emily's manipulations, gathering emails, notes, and screenshots, but no amount of preparation could soften the emotional sting of confrontation. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Olivia had returned home later than usual, her hair slightly tousled from the wind and rain. She was weary, but still carried the poise that made her appear untouchable. Daniel greeted her quietly, careful not to let any tension show in his voice. Emily, seated at the kitchen counter, had a book open, but was clearly eavesdropping, her eyes darting between them with the precision of a practiced observer. Olivia's gaze fell on Daniel, sharp and searching.
Daniel, she began, her voice controlled, I think we need to talk. Daniel nodded slowly. I agree, he said, his tone steady but edged with anticipation. He had rehearsed countless scenarios, but nothing could fully prepare him for the intensity of what was about to unfold. Emily, sensing the gravity of the moment, put her book down. Are you guys fighting again? She asked, innocently, though her smirk betrayed the faintest satisfaction. Daniel felt a surge of frustration, but swallowed it. He knew the storm was already here, and anger would only feed the flames. Olivia spoke first, laying out what she had heard from Emily, the subtle accusations, the anecdotes, the interpretations of Daniel's behavior. I don't understand why you always get frustrated with her, Olivia said, her eyes searching his for a hint of truth. She tells me you're strict, controlling, sometimes mean. Her voice was not accusatory, but it carried the weight of doubt, of years of maternal instinct now being tested. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He pulled the envelope from his briefcase, spreading its contents on the table. Olivia, these aren't misunderstandings. These are deliberate manipulations. Emily has been framing me, twisting every word, every action, to create a narrative that isn't true. Olivia froze, her eyes scanning the pages. Emails, notes, and screenshots lay before her, each one meticulously annotated by Daniel. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up a folded note in Emily's handwriting. Dad doesn't understand me. Mom should know. The faintest flush of realization crept over her face. Daniel, Olivia's voice faltered. She looked at Emily, then back at him, a mix of shock and disbelief clouding her expression. I had no idea. Emily's composure cracked slightly. The mask she had worn so carefully began to falter under the weight of evidence. I didn't mean, she stammered, her green eyes wide. For the first time, Daniel saw the vulnerability behind the calculated facade, though it was still tinged with defensiveness. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The truth was finally visible, yet it came at a cost. Olivia's disappointment was palpable, not just in Emily but in herself, for believing without question, for being blind to subtle signs, for allowing doubt to erode trust. The room was heavy with unspoken words, emotions simmering just beneath the surface. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The truth was finally visible. I love both of you, Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but soft. I've never tried to hurt either of you, but the lies, the manipulations, they've caused real damage. I had to protect myself, and in a way, all of us. Olivia sank into a chair, the weight of comprehension pressing down on her. I see that now, she murmured. Tears threatened at the edges of her eyes. She reached out, placing a tentative hand on Daniel's. I should have listened. I should have trusted you. Emily, still seated, looked between them, guilt washing over her youthful features. I didn't know what I was doing, she admitted, her voice small. I just wanted her to like me. I thought if you were the problem, she'd protect me. I didn't mean to hurt you. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her confession. He understood the complexity of adolescent fear, the desire for validation, the instinct to manipulate situations for self-preservation, but he also recognized the magnitude of the emotional toll, the months of isolation, frustration, and mistrust that had accumulated in his chest. The night stretched on, filled with tentative conversation, apologies, and the careful reconstruction of fractured trust. Daniel could feel the shift subtly, the room no longer charged with accusation, but beginning to breathe with acknowledgement. Olivia asked questions, seeking understanding. Emily responded with honesty, a fragile truth forming in the cracks of their shared pain. Daniel reflected on the breaking point itself, not a sudden explosion of anger, but a slow accumulation of doubt, isolation, and misinterpretation that had brought them here. The confrontation was inevitable, a necessary rupture to allow truth to surface, and though it left scars, It also laid the foundation for healing, for transparency, and for a reassessment of family dynamics that had been dangerously skewed by perception. By the time Daniel went to bed, the apartment was quiet. Rain had ceased, leaving streets gleaming and reflective beneath city lights. He stared at the ceiling, feeling exhaustion mingled with relief. The breaking point had been reached. The truth had been revealed, and though the work of rebuilding trust would be long and delicate, Daniel felt a tentative sense of hope. In the Harper household, the illusion of perfection had shattered, not in anger or violence, but in quiet confrontation, documentation, and acknowledgement of subtle betrayals. And as Daniel drifted to sleep, he realized that truth, once unearthed, had a power of its own, capable of dissolving manipulation, restoring clarity, and beginning the slow process of healing hearts that had been kept apart by shadows.
Saturday morning arrived, with sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the Harper apartment, casting warm beams on the oak floors and familiar furniture. Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, the envelope of evidence from the previous week still resting beside his laptop. The air was charged with a new energy, not tense or fearful, but expectant, as if the household itself had been holding its breath, waiting for acknowledgement, for clarity. Olivia entered the kitchen, her steps measured, her eyes no longer guarded but reflective. She placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate work they had begun. "I've been thinking all night," she said softly. "I can see now what you were telling me, what Emily was doing. I should have paid attention earlier. I should have listened to you." Daniel met his gaze, seeing both remorse and determination. "It wasn't just Emily," he replied carefully. "It was the way perception can be manipulated. Lies can grow quietly, invisibly, until even love becomes confused with suspicion." Emily appeared then, standing in the doorway, her green eyes wide and unguarded. She shifted nervously, clutching her school bag, the smirk of calculated charm replaced by the vulnerability of a child confronting consequences. I want to say sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to make things so broken." Daniel exhaled, feeling the tightness in his chest ease slightly. He reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "I know you didn't realize the impact, Emily, but the truth is out now, and that matters. What we do next, how we move forward, that's what counts." The family gathered at the breakfast table, the first meal in days that felt honest, unguarded. Olivia and Daniel discussed the emails, the notes, and the ways Emily had manipulated perceptions, making sure Emily understood the seriousness without shaming her excessively. Daniel emphasized transparency and accountability, focusing on the lessons rather than punishment alone. Emily listened intently, occasionally glancing at her mother and father, absorbing their words. It was a quiet, deliberate learning, the kind that could change behavior more profoundly than anger or rebuke. She nodded, occasionally offering clarifying questions, demonstrating that she wanted to repair trust and rebuild the relationship she had strained with her choices. After breakfast, Daniel suggested they walk along the nearby riverfront, a place he often retreated to when clarity was needed. Olivia and Emily agreed, and the family stepped into the crisp morning air. The city seemed unusually serene, the chaos of traffic and crowds softened by the reflective river and gentle spring breeze. Walking side by side, Daniel felt a new understanding settling between them. He observed Emily closely, not with suspicion, but with careful awareness of growth. She was thoughtful now, occasionally commenting on small injustices or misinterpretations, but her tone was collaborative rather than accusatory. Olivia, too, moved with a renewed sense of partnership, actively engaging Daniel in conversation, showing trust rebuilt not through words alone, but through attentive action. By the river, Daniel paused, looking at the water flowing steadily beneath the bridge. "Truth is like this river," he said, gesturing to the current. "It can be obscured, diverted, or polluted by small things, but it always seeks its path. What matters is letting it run clear and then walking alongside it." Olivia smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "And even when it's messy, we can still choose how we respond." Emily looked up at them both, eyes bright with tentative clarity. "I understand," she said softly. "I don't want to make things worse. I want to be honest." That afternoon, the Harpers returned home, carrying the sense of accomplishment that comes from confronting hidden truths. The envelope of documents had been carefully filed away, not as weapons, but as reminders of the fragility of perception and the necessity of communication. They talked openly about the past weeks, acknowledging mistakes and exploring ways to prevent similar misunderstandings. Daniel emphasized transparency and accountability, focusing on the lessons rather than punishment alone. Emily listened intently, occasionally glancing at her mother and father, absorbing their words. It was a quiet, deliberate learning, the kind that could change behavior more profoundly than anger or rebuke. She nodded, occasionally offering clarifying questions, demonstrating that she wanted to repair trust and rebuild the relationship she had strained with her choices. As evening fell, Daniel stood on the balcony, gazing out at the city bathed in golden light. The streets below, once a blur of chaos, now seemed to reflect the subtle order he had been striving to restore at home. Olivia joined him, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. Emily appeared moments later, leaning against the railing, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Daniel felt the emotional weight of recent weeks lift slightly, replaced by cautious hope. The truth had been revealed, the breaking point had passed, and in its aftermath, a more resilient foundation had been laid, one built not on control, fear, or perfection, but on understanding, transparency, and the enduring power of familial love. The Harper family, though scarred, had begun the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding. The seeds of distrust had been uprooted, and though growth would take time, the truth now had space to flourish. And Daniel Harper, standing with the two people he cherished most, understood that revelation, honesty, and trust were the pillars that would carry them forward, together, stronger than before.
The Monday after the revelation brought with it a stillness in the Harper apartment, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the consequences of the weekend. Daniel moved through the rooms with a quiet determination, aware that while the truth had been revealed, the work of emotional reconciliation had only just begun. The unspoken tension between him, Olivia, and Emily lingered, like an echo that refused to fade. It began in the living room that evening. Olivia had suggested a family meeting, a deliberate, structured conversation where emotions could be aired safely. Daniel agreed, understanding that avoidance would only allow lingering resentment to fester. Emily perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture tense, hands clasped in her lap while Olivia settled in a chair across from him, her gaze calm but expectant. "I think we need to talk about what happened," Olivia began, her voice steady. "Not just the lies, but how it made all of us feel. We need to get it out in the open." Daniel nodded. "I agree. It's important we understand each other fully, not just the events, but the emotions that came with them." He felt the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. Emotional confrontation was always riskier than factual revelation. Words could wound, intentions could be misread, and even truth could hurt. Emily spoke first, her voice quivering slightly. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted Mom to like me. I thought if you saw you as the problem, she'd be on my side." Her green eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Daniel felt a mixture of sorrow and empathy. The manipulation, deliberate though it was, had arisen from fear, insecurity, and a desperate desire for validation. Olivia listened quietly, absorbing her daughter's words. "Emily," she said gently, "I love you no matter what, but the truth matters. When lies are told, even if they're small, they hurt everyone involved, especially when it comes between people who care for each other." Daniel reached out, resting a hand on Emily's shoulder. He said, "I know it's complicated. I understand why you did what you did, but we need honesty now more than ever. That's how we heal." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. "I know," she whispered. I'm sorry. Really. I never wanted to make you feel like you weren't loved. I was scared." The confession hung in the air, heavy but cathartic. Daniel felt a knot in his chest begin to loosen. He realized that confrontation was not about assigning blame entirely, but about allowing feelings to be voiced, acknowledged, and processed. He turned his attention to Olivia, whose expression carried the weight of guilt she had felt for believing without question. "I should have listened to you," Olivia admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I trusted Emily so much that I didn't see the way you were trying to protect us, protect me. I let her narrative cloud my judgment. Daniel took her hand gently. He said, "It's not about blame. It's about understanding and moving forward. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we respond now." The conversation shifted gradually, from explanations to reflections, from tears to tentative laughter. Emily shared her fears, her misunderstandings, and her longing for parental approval. Olivia spoke of the strain of balancing motherly instinct with trust in her husband. Daniel revealed the isolation he had felt, the internal battles he had fought silently, and the strategies he had considered to reclaim truth and fairness. By mid-evening, the atmosphere in the apartment had transformed. The room, once heavy with unspoken resentments, now carried a fragile sense of relief, as if a storm had passed and the air was temporarily cleansed. Daniel observed Emily closely. She was quieter now, reflective rather than reactive. Olivia's eyes, usually warm but occasionally clouded by doubt, now held clarity and recognition. Daniel reflected on the subtle power of emotional confrontation. Facts alone could reveal manipulation, but only open dialogue could restore trust, heal wounds, and rebuild emotional bridges. Words, tone, pauses, and even silences became instruments of reconciliation. Every acknowledgement of hurt, every sincere apology was a step toward repairing the bonds that had been strained almost to breaking. As night deepened, the family gathered in the living room, blankets draped over shoulders, the glow of city lights through the windows casting soft shadows. They talked quietly, sharing memories of times before distrust had taken root, recalling small gestures of love, moments of connection that had been overshadowed by lies. It was an intimate reclamation of space and emotion, a reminder that beneath misperceptions, the love that had built the Harper family remained intact. Daniel knew that healing would take time. Trust, once fractured, required consistent care, repeated demonstrations of honesty, and the courage to confront uncomfortable emotions. But for the first time in weeks, he felt confident that the foundation was being restored, brick by careful brick. He watched Emily curl up on the sofa, leaning against her mother, and felt a quiet surge of hope. The seeds of distrust had been uprooted, the truth laid bare, and the emotional confrontation had allowed feelings to surface, be acknowledged, and begin their slow journey toward resolution. As night deepened, Daniel turned off the lights and prepared for bed. He reflected on the lesson that had emerged with painful clarity. Emotional confrontation, though daunting, was essential. Without it, even truth could remain powerless. With it, even the deepest wounds could find the first whispers of healing. And, in the Harper household, amidst lingering shadows, a new chapter was beginning, one grounded in honesty, understanding, and the resilient bond of family. The Sunday sun filtered softly through the Harper apartment, casting warm, golden hues over the living room. After weeks of tension, revelation, and emotional confrontation, the atmosphere felt lighter, imbued with a fragile sense of balance. Daniel sat in the armchair near the window, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the city below. The skyline, once a blur of noise and distraction, now seemed reflective of the internal clarity he was beginning to feel. Olivia entered the room carrying a stack of family albums, her eyes gentle, her movements unhurried. She placed the albums on the coffee table and sat beside him. "I thought we could spend some time today, just us, remembering and reconnecting," she said softly. "Not just the past, but how far we've come." Daniel smiled faintly, a mix of relief and contentment softening his usually taut features. "I'd like that." The past weeks had been a crucible, painful, isolating, and testing in ways he had never anticipated. But the truth, now fully revealed, had allowed them to rebuild on a stronger foundation. Emily joined them moments later, curling up on the sofa with a notebook in hand. She was quiet, reflective, occasionally sharing observations about the photos or small memories. Her demeanor had shifted subtly over the past days, from defensive and cunning to contemplative and sincere. The child who had once manipulated perception to secure her mother's favor now appeared genuinely engaged in understanding the consequences of her actions. Daniel reflected on the journey, the isolation, the distrust, the subtle manipulations that had fractured their family. He understood now that perception was a fragile thing, easily swayed, yet also recoverable through patience, communication, and courage. The evidence he had uncovered, the confrontations he had initiated, and the emotional honesty they had embraced together were not just steps toward restoring trust, they were instruments of healing. Olivia turned the pages of an album, pausing at a photo of Daniel and Emily at a park months ago. She smiled faintly. "I had forgotten this," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "You were so patient with her. I see now how much you've given, even when it was hard." Daniel nodded, touched by her acknowledgement. "I just wanted to be fair, to be seen clearly, and to help Emily feel understood. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Emily looked up from her notebook, eyes bright. "I think I understand now. I see how my actions hurt both of you. I didn't mean to. I didn't know how to say what I felt without causing problems. But I want to try. Really try to be honest and help fix things." Her words, simple yet heartfelt, carried the weight of genuine reflection. Daniel felt a wave of emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and hope. The confrontation, the revelation, the painstaking unraveling of lies had yielded understanding, and with it, the potential for enduring connection. Olivia reached for Daniel's hand, intertwining their fingers. "We've been through a lot, but I believe we can move forward stronger. We know now that communication, honesty, and trust aren't just words, they're actions we have to nurture every day."
Daniel felt the resonance of her statement. He thought of the silent evenings when he had endured misperceptions, the tension that had stretched like a taut wire between him and his family. Those moments had been agonizing, but they had also taught him the value of patience, discernment, and measured confrontation. Later that afternoon, the family sat together in the living room, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of connection. The dynamic had shifted subtly but profoundly. Emily was more open, reflective, and considerate. Olivia was attentive, trusting, and conscious of perception. Daniel, for his part, felt seen, understood, and finally at peace within the household he had fought to protect. As the day waned, Daniel stepped onto the balcony, looking out over the Chicago skyline as the sun dipped behind the tall buildings. The streets below glimmered with reflections of light, a metaphor, he thought, for clarity emerging from shadow. He inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp evening air, and felt a sense of resolution settle over him. The family had endured manipulation, isolation, and doubt, but they had emerged on the other side with insight, empathy, and renewed bonds. Olivia joined him on the balcony, her hand finding his. "It's not perfect," she said quietly, "but it's real, and that's what matters." Daniel nodded. "It's more than I hoped for. We faced the worst of misunderstandings and deception, and yet here we are. That's what counts. Truth, acknowledgement, and the willingness to rebuild." Emily appeared behind them, leaning lightly against the railing. "I think we can do this," she said, voice firm yet gentle. "We'll have mistakes, but I want to try, really try, to keep us honest and connected." Daniel looked at her, then at Olivia, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been painful, the stakes high, but the outcome, truth, understanding, and the slow restoration of trust, was worth every moment of struggle. As night fell and city lights twinkled like scattered stars, the Harper family stood together on the balcony, a family scarred yet resilient. Daniel reflected on the lessons learned. Perception could be deceived, isolation could erode confidence, and subtle lies could undermine even the strongest bonds. Yet, truth, courage, and open-hearted confrontation could restore what had been broken, and perhaps even make it stronger than before. In that quiet, reflective moment, Daniel Harper understood fully that healing was not a singular event, but a continuous effort. And as the city hummed beneath them, the Harper family, united by honesty and understanding, took the first steps into a future defined not by illusion, but by the careful cultivation of love, trust, and unwavering commitment.